Imagine, facing years in prison for a single retweet that honestly almost nobody even saw. And picture walking into a courtroom to defend your freedom, but instead of bringing like a big stack of legal precedents, your only defense attorney is the laws of physics.
Right, which is just a wild concept from the jump.
It really is, because usually when you picture a catastrophic event, something that actually warrants severe criminal charges, like a riot or an avalanche, you instinctively imagine this massive explosive trigger. A stick of dynamite, an earthquake, something proportional to the disaster itself.
Exactly. I mean, our brains are biologically wired to look for big causes when we observe big effects. You prefer a clean, sort of symmetrical equation where the input energy directly matches the output energy.
Yeah, it makes sense.
It gives us this sense of predictability in what is otherwise a totally chaotic world.
But then you step into the realm of complex systems, and suddenly that comforting symmetrical equation completely breaks down. You find yourself staring at a single microscopic snowflake, and a prosecutor is pointing at it completely seriously and saying to a judge, hey, that snowflake just destroyed the entire mountain.
Which sounds, frankly, patently absurd when you frame it that way.
Right.
It completely defies basic physical intuition. A single snowflake simply does not contain the kinetic energy required to shatter a mountainside.
And that profound tension, between a microscopic action and a macroscopic catastrophe is at the very heart of what we are exploring with you today. Welcome to today's deep dive. Our mission today is to unpack this extraordinary, highly unusual case. We're looking at the story of a man named Dr. Jingyuan Chen.
Yeah, fascinating individual.
Truly. He is a scientist who defended himself against a criminal charge, not just with standard legal statutes, but by actually deploying statistical physics, complex network theory, and the psychology of authority.
Right. And he was accused of what is legally classified as the PXQT crime, which essentially translates to picking quarrels and provoking trouble.
Broadly, disrupting public order, right?
Exactly. And the specific action that supposedly caused this severe systemic disruption was just sharing information on Twitter, specifically retweeting foreign official statements and political speeches.
Now, before we dive into the mechanics of this, we need to be incredibly clear with you about the nature of this deep dive. The sources we are working from today contain highly politically charged content regarding the Chinese judicial system and state policies.
Yes, very important to note.
We must emphasize unequivocally that we are strictly maintaining absolute impartiality here. We are not endorsing, we are not supporting, and we are not taking sides on any of the political viewpoints, any criticisms of the judicial system, or the defendant's specific claims of innocence.
Right, we are just looking at the arguments.
Exactly. Our sole purpose today is to impartially report on and analyze the fascinating intellectual and scientific arguments contained within the source material you've provided.
Because we are examining the architecture of a really unconventional defense strategy. I mean, it's a rare opportunity to see empirical science applied directly against a highly subjective legal interpretation.
Because how does a scientist use the physics of a snowball and the psychology of authority to prove that a single retweet couldn't possibly disrupt the public order? Okay, let's unpack this.
What's fascinating here is that Dr. Chen didn't just argue a standard legal defense.
Yeah.
He didn't just say, I didn't do it. He attempted to mathematically prove that the crime, as described by the prosecution, was a physical impossibility.
Wow.
Yeah. To understand his defense, we really have to start with the physical reality of the act. The prosecution claimed his retweets caused, quote, severe confusion of public order. So we must ask the foundational scientific question. Can a single microaction genuinely break a macro system?
Okay, and to tackle that, I know Dr. Chen brought in something called the Galton-Watson branching process. Now, I'm somewhat familiar with this in the context of, family trees, but how on earth does a mathematical model from the 1800s disprove a modern criminal charge?
Well, the Galton-Watson process is essentially a way to calculate how things propagate through a population. You can use it for a genetic lineage, sure, but also the spread of a virus, or in this case, the flow of information on a social network.
Okay, I follow.
And the critical metric inside this whole model is a variable called M, which represents the average branch number. So in the context of Twitter, M basically means for every one person who sees a post, how many people do they subsequently share it with?
Ah, so it's like the viral coefficient. If I share it with 2 people, M is 2.
Correct. And for a cascade, meaning a viral event actually capable of disrupting a system to occur, M absolutely must be greater than 1.
Because otherwise it just fizzles out.
Exactly. The math demands it. But the empirical data from Dr. Chen's account paints a starkly different picture. He had fewer than 100 followers. His posts had near zero interaction. His M was far, far less than 1.
Wow.
In the terminology of statistical physics, his network was deeply subcritical. The math dictates that any cascade of information starting from his account would die out almost instantly.
So it's not even a debate.
No, the probability of a massive chain reaction isn't just low. It mathematically approaches zero.
But he didn't stop at branching processes, right? The source material shows he leaned heavily into the fluctuation dissipation theorem, or FDT. I've always found this concept super compelling, but it's usually applied to, like, thermodynamics.
Yeah.
How does he map FDT onto a random social media post?
It's actually a brilliant application. FDT states that a system's response to an external perturbation, a disturbance, depends entirely on the system's own internal structure, not just the external force itself.
Okay, so the system matters more than the spark.
Right. The response function of the system is the hidden variable here. Think of throwing a pebble into a calm pond. The pebble is the perturbation, and you get a few small ripples, right?
Sure.
But if you throw that exact same pebble into a pond filled with a highly volatile, supersaturated explosive liquid, the response is massive.
Boom.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But the pebble didn't possess the energy of the explosion. The system did.
Oh, this sounds exactly like self-organized criticality, where a large avalanche only happens if the system is already at a critical tipping point. It's like throwing a single grain of sand into the Pacific Ocean and being blamed for a tsunami. The grain of sand cannot physically contain the kinetic energy required to move an ocean.
Precisely. The statistical physics here argue that the system's temperament is determined from within. If a macro-level disruption occurs, FDT insists we have to look at the internal tension of the system, not the micro-perturbation.
But wait, let me push back on this assumption for a second. Let's stick with the sand analogy. Couldn't one grain of sand cause a landslide if the sandcastle is already crumbling? I mean, even if his account is a tiny fringe node on the network, can we truly say it could never cause a cascade? A single spark from a campfire is microscopic, but it can still burn down 1 million acres of dry forest. Why couldn't his retweet be the spark?
It's a fair question, but we have to look at the specific topology of the network involved to answer that. Social media simply does not operate like a uniform forest. It operates on what we call scale-free networks.
Okay, what does that mean in this context?
It means the architecture consists of a few massive hubs, accounts with millions of followers and millions of fringe nodes with almost no connections. The mathematical reality of scale-free networks is that fringe nodes have an effective branching capacity approaching zero.
They just don't have the reach.
They physically lack the pathways to spread the fire. They are sparks falling into a vacuum, not a dry forest.
So it's not a matter of probability, it's a matter of structural impossibility.
Furthermore, if we return to FDT, if a massive response did somehow magically occur from a fringe node's post, the mathematics of the theorem dictate that the system itself was already highly critical.
Meaning it was ready to blow anyway.
Right. The systemic tension, the pre-existing volatility engineered by the system's own structure, is the sole cause of the disruption. The fringe node is statistically indistinguishable from background noise.
Well, this brings us to a massive contradiction then. If the mathematics and the physics definitively prove that Dr. Chen's retweets physically lacked the capacity to cause a system-wide disruption, how did the judicial system actually justify the charge? I mean, they had to bypass the math entirely.
They did.
And the second pillar of his defense suggests they did this by basically warping the fundamental structure of logic and legal language.
That's exactly what the source material highlights. It describes a phenomenon philosophers call category mistakes occurring deep within the legal documents.
Category mistake.
Yeah. It happens when a system treats things of one kind as if they fundamentally belong to another. In this case, the court categorized art, specifically satirical cartoons, along with subjective opinions and abstract academic theories, as verifiable false information.
But that completely breaks the rules of language. You cannot fact-check a cartoon. You can't put an academic theory through a lie detector to see if it's true or false in a legal penal sense. They are expressive or explanatory tools. They aren't descriptive empirical facts.
No, they aren't.
Treating a philosophy debate as fake news is like trying to measure the temperature of a song. It's a complete mismatch of categories.
It really is. And the linguistic warping becomes even more pronounced with a tactic the defense labels semantic inflation. To understand how this works, we have to look at the actual legal thresholds. The judicial interpretations actually set hard quantitative standards. To legally prove a disruption of public order via the internet, the rules require evidence of 500 retweets or 5,000 views.
But we already established his numbers were nowhere near that. His M was subcritical. So how did they bridge the gap between his actual numbers and the legal requirement?
They bypassed the math by swapping the vocabulary. Because they lacked the numbers for a standard disruption of social order, the legal documents stealthily upgraded the charge to a vaguely defined moral equivalent. Severe confusion of public order.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, they inflated the severity of the words to artificially fill the void left by the missing empirical data.
So they basically created a reality made entirely of words, completely divorced from physical evidence. And the logic fallacies, just to jump right off the page here, the prosecution essentially argued a loop of circular reasoning. The information he shared was false because it was harmful to the order, and it was harmful to the order because it was false. There's no external anchor to reality.
None.
Yeah.
And we also see a profound ad hominem assumption doing heavy lifting for the prosecution.
Right.
The documents argued that because Dr. Chen possesses a PhD, he must have known the information was false.
Yeah.
They weaponized his academic identity as a substitute for actual material evidence of intent.
It's like arresting a poet for fraud because they wrote, it's raining cats and dogs and no animals actually fell from the sky. And the prosecutor stands up and says, well, you have a master of fine arts in poetry. You should have known meteorologically that mammals don't precipitate. Therefore, you intentionally lied to the public.
And that is precisely the cognitive leap we're seeing. It illustrates the exact mechanism at play.
But aren't courts, by their very design, supposed to rely on hard evidence? How does a pseudo proposition, a claim with no real-world referent, no empirical data, no actual physical riot or panic to point to survive a formal adversarial legal process?
The sources point to the mechanics of result-driven reasoning. In a standard logical framework, evidence leads to a conclusion.
Right, A leads to B.
Here the process is inverted. The teleological goal, the conclusion that this specific individual needed to be penalized, was established first. The facts, the semantic definitions, and the logical steps were then retroactively constructed to support that predetermined conclusion.
Wow. Working backwards.
Exactly. The system utilized broad, moral, and political judgments, framing the defendant as a threat to ideological stability rather than strictly applying a penal code based on material evidence.
Which naturally pivots us to the most human element of this entire deep dive. If a court is engaging in result-driven reasoning and semantic inflation, it's so easy to picture a room full of villains plotting in secret. But our sources suggest this isn't necessarily a grand conspiracy, is it? It's the byproduct of deeply ingrained social psychology and a severe clash between two entirely different cultural frameworks.
That's the crux of it. To decode the behavior of the courtroom actors, we have to apply the foundational theories of social psychology. Specifically Stanley Milgram's obedience theory and Solomon Asch's conformity experiments. The prosecutors and judges in this scenario are exhibiting textbook institutional obedience.
Okay, so Milgram's famous shock experiments showed that average people will inflict severe pain on another person simply because an authority figure in a white lab coat tells them to. In this courtroom context, how does that obedience manifest?
It manifests as a massive diffusion of responsibility. The individuals operating the legal machinery essentially abandon their personal critical judgment to follow systemic commands. The prosecutor or judge doesn't have to personally reconcile the math of the Galton-Watson process with the charge. They simply tell themselves, I am just applying the label the system requires me to apply. The system bears the moral weight, not me.
Right. And Ass's conformity experiments proved that people will literally ignore the plain evidence of their own eyes, like the length of a line drawn on a board, just to align with the consensus of the group. If the entire institution agrees the snowflake caused the avalanche, the individual judge will ignore the physics to stay in the group.
Exactly.
But looking deeper, we are seeing a massive collision of two fundamentally opposed meaning systems, because Dr. Chen belongs to what cultural psychologists term an open epistemic culture. In this framework, information is merely raw material for discussion. Doubt is highly valued. Uncertainty is just the starting point for research.
Yes, and in stark contrast, the judicial system in this case operates on a normative control culture. This culture demands absolute certainty. It treats unverified or conflicting information not as a curiosity to be explored, but as an immediate risk. It's viewed as a pathogen threatening collective stability.
And there's a glaring policy contradiction here that Dr. Chen actually highlighted, right? The broader state has a stated national macro policy promoting a community of human destiny, which actively encourages international cultural exchange and diversity of thought.
Right, on paper.
Yet, by treating foreign official accounts and diverse academic debates as illegal rumors, the local court was functionally outlawing the state's own macro policy.
It highlights a severe disconnect between the state's theoretical, outward-facing philosophy and the rigid, anxiety-driven mechanics of its local enforcement institutions.
So what does this all mean? It seems like a massive cultural mistranslation. The system observes a researcher engaging in a normal, open, intellectual debate, but because its normative control framework is entirely defensive, it processes him as a virus attacking the host. The immune system, the court launches a massive autoimmune overreaction to a harmless protein.
That biological metaphor captures the institutional panic perfectly.
But let me challenge Dr. Chen's own framing for a moment. He calls these actors a judicial mafia in his writings. But if the system is simply acting out of a normative control culture, blindly obeying its own psychological programming and diffusing responsibility, doesn't that make the judicial actors victims of their own psychological environment? I mean, is it genuine malice or just profound institutional blindness?
The psychological analysis within the text suggests it is a phenomenon known as role conflict. Rather than pure individual malice, we are observing a systemic, defensive social mechanism.
Interesting.
When rigid institutions are confronted with information that challenges their carefully constructed narrative, they experience profound systemic anxiety. To reduce that anxiety and maintain an illusion of legitimacy, they instinctively label any deviance as a rumor or a threat. They are acting out of a desperate institutional imperative to maintain order and certainty at all costs. They are protecting the integrity of the sandcastle by outlawing the concept of sand. We've analyzed the physics of the retweet, the collapse of the legal language, and the psychology of the courtroom. But what about the psychology of the man sitting in the center of it all? How does a person locked in this Kafkaesque machine facing intense interrogation, isolation, and a system entirely immune to his logic maintain his sanity? And not just maintain it, but produce a defense heavily utilizing statistical physics and Gödel's incompleteness theorems.
It's incredible. To comprehend his resilience, we evaluate Dr. Chen's personality profile through the Big Five personality model. The text reveals an individual scoring extremely high in openness to experience and conscientiousness.
This specific combination creates what psychologists call a theoretical or cognitive dominant personality.
And according to self-determination theory, this means he's operating almost purely on intrinsic motivation, right? He is driven by autonomy and epistemic curiosity. He isn't defending himself to seek a reward or to merely avoid punishment. Those are extrinsic factors. He is defending the structural integrity of truth itself because his conscientious nature demands it.
Exactly. But the truly astounding element is his emotion regulation. Most individuals subjected to this level of systemic pressure would experience a severe trauma response. We're talking emotional breakdown, panic, or total submission.
Right, understandably.
Instead, Dr. Chen employs the psychological defense mechanisms of sublimation and intellectualization.
Here's where it gets really interesting. I've heard the term sublimation before, but how exactly does it work when you're literally sitting in a detention center?
Sublimation is a mechanism where the mind takes raw, unacceptable, or overwhelming impulses like pure terror or explosive anger and channels them into a culturally acceptable, highly complex, often intellectual activity.
Wow.
He essentially takes the immense stress of his prosecution and processes it exclusively through the highest levels of cognitive reasoning.
It's like a biologist being chased through the woods by a grizzly bear, and instead of screaming in terror, they pull out a notebook and start calmly documenting the biomechanics of the bear's running stride.
That is a perfect analogy.
He engaged in profound meaning-making. He completely reframed his suffering. In his mind, he wasn't merely a victim of an unjust charge. He was a participant observer. He was recording a historical and civilizational event to serve as data for future readers.
This cognitive reframing is absolutely vital. It protects the ego from disintegration and imbues the suffering with profound purpose. And this is also where his use of Gödel's incompleteness theorems becomes a brilliant coping strategy.
Wait, I need you to break that down for me. I know Gödel was a legendary mathematician, but what do incompleteness theorems have to do with surviving a trial?
Well, in the 1930s, Kurt Gödel proved mathematically that any complex, closed system of logical rules will always contain true statements that simply cannot be proven by the rules of the system itself. No system can be both complete and perfectly consistent from the inside.
Okay, so applied to the courtroom.
Dr. Chen realized the judicial system was a closed, logical loop. It was incapable of recognizing the objective truth of his physics because its internal rules, semantic inflation, result-driven reasoning, were practically designed to reject it. By applying Gödel, Dr. Chen stepped outside the system.
Oh, that's brilliant.
He accepted that the court was fundamentally incomplete. This realization freed him from the maddening frustration of trying to make a closed system see a truth it was mathematically programmed to ignore.
But is there a hidden danger in this approach? I mean, by heavily intellectualizing his trauma, by turning his visceral pain into a detached thesis on complex systems and Gödel, does he risk suppressing his own humanity? Does he isolate himself on this high intellectual peak, creating this sort of cognitive island, completely disconnected from the reality of the society around him?
The source material actually acknowledges that exact risk. There is an inherent danger of over-intellectualization. By building a defense so deeply rooted in advanced physics and abstract logic, he basically guaranteed it would be entirely incomprehensible to the very people judging him.
Right.
However, the analysis firmly concludes that in extreme, oppressive environments, this highly integrated, principle-driven psychological structure is not a pathology. It is the very mechanism that prevents a total mental collapse. It is supreme resilience.
He didn't let the system's broken logic define his reality. He used science to define his own. He essentially said, you have the power to lock me in a cell, but you do not have the power to change the laws of physics, and you cannot force me to accept a flawed equation.
It represents the ultimate assertion of cognitive autonomy in the face of overwhelming systemic pressure.
So, bringing this all back to you listening right now, why does the story of Dr. Jingwon Chen matter if you aren't, a statistical physicist or a constitutional lawyer? This deep dive shows us that when a highly rational individual collides with a rigid defensive institution, the battle isn't just fought with legal codes, it's fought with the very structure of language, the physics of how information moves, and the fundamental psychology of conformity, authority, and resilience.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, understanding the mechanics of this case equips you to see the invisible forces shaping the institutions you interact with every single day. Semantic inflation, cognitive dissonance, institutional obedience, diffusion of responsibility. These aren't just academic theories locked in a textbook.
Not at all.
They are the active mechanisms that determine how organizations make decisions, how they react to perceived threats, and ultimately, how they define what is true.
Exactly. When your workplace enforces a completely nonsensical rule just because that's how we've always done it, or a bureaucracy refuses to look at clear empirical evidence because it contradicts their internal policy, you are witnessing the exact same psychological and linguistic mechanisms at play, just operating on a different scale.
Dr. Chen's defense serves as a masterclass in recognizing those hidden systems operating beneath the surface of our constructed social reality.
It truly is a masterclass. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We've explored the mathematics of avalanches, the breaking of legal language, and the astonishing resilience of a mind under siege. But we want to leave you with one final provocative thought to ponder as you go about your day.
Yes, a fundamental question regarding the nature of systemic fragility.
Think back to that mountain and that single microscopic snowflake. If a massive, complex social system is so profoundly brittle, so deeply anxious, that it feels compelled to treat a practically invisible post from a fringe node as an existential systemic threat. Wait, sorry, if it treats it as a systemic threat, what does that actually tell us about the true underlying stability of that system?
It forces us to ask, is it a mountain made of solid stone, or is it a mountain made entirely of sand?
We'll let you decide. Thanks for diving deep with us.